Hi everyone, I'm Mr. Irvin, and today I'm going to talk to you about the youth culture that developed in the United States during the 1960s. In today's lecture, we are going to look at the growing political activism of young Americans, as well as the counterculture that developed around them. So we should probably begin by defining that term, counterculture. A counterculture is a cultural movement that defies the established norms of society. There have been many examples of countercultures throughout US history. Think like the Lost Generation in the 1920s and the Beatniks of the 1950s. However, the counterculture of the 1960s that developed around America's youth at that time is by far the most famous culture. So, in order to understand Woodstock and the counterculture, we need to backtrack a little bit to the 1950s so that we can understand what mainstream culture in America looked like at that time period. So, in the years following World War II, the United States had gone through a period of significant economic growth. Many Americans coming back from the war used the GI Bill to go to college and earn degrees that would land them better jobs. Other Americans used the GI Bill to buy a home for the first time. As a result, there was a massive migration of Americans to the suburbs. For many returning veterans of World War II, it was cheaper to buy a suburban house as opposed to rent an apartment in the city. These suburban houses were ideal for starting a family, and the move to the suburbs was accompanied by a baby boom, which was a huge explosion in the birth rates within the United States. Between 1945 and 1950, 50 million babies were born in the United States. So, the culture that emerged in the suburbs of America was one that was both conservative and also driven by consumerism. In the 1950s, televisions became affordable for the average American. This ushered in the golden age of television, which was marked by TV shows like The Honeymooners and I Love Lucy. However, it also proved to be a golden age of advertising as well, with companies being able to market their products through TV commercials. The increase in advertising, coupled with the economic prosperity of many Americans, led to a new consumer culture within the United States. Across the country, many Americans rushed to buy the latest products to fill their new suburban homes. However, this new consumer culture also encouraged conformity. The houses being built in Levittowns across the nation were all the same. Americans were tuning into the same three channels, watching the same three shows, and being indoctrinated into the same middle-class idea of the American dream. The 1950s proved to create stability, yes, but it also led to restlessness, which was especially evident in America's youth. So the baby boomer generation, or the generation born after World War II, grew up believing that they could change the world for the better. However, the 1960s, which was the decade that generation came of age, proved to be one of the most turbulent times in American history. It was the era of the civil rights movement, the growth of feminism, and it was also a time of political turmoil created by the controversial war in Vietnam. Many young Americans became disillusioned by the continued racism, sexism, and support for warfare that existed within American society. These young Americans began to question traditional American values and the institutions that supported them, such as churches, schools, and parents. The youth of the 1960s increasingly looked at authority figures with suspicion and mistrust. A popular slogan, for example, in the 1960s stated, "Trust no one over 30." So skepticism of authority created a cultural divide between younger Americans and the older generations. Many young Americans became part of the growing counterculture movement of the 1960s. The counterculture rebelled against mainstream society by challenging traditional styles of dress, music, living conditions, and views on sex and drugs, which had long been established in the 1950s and even before that. So these hippies, or flower children, as they were sometimes called, rejected their parents' clean-cut look and instead donned long hair, beards, beads, and jeans. Outraged by the Vietnam War, many middle-class children participated in organized protests on college campuses. Others turned to mind-bending drugs, which included LSD. The soundtrack of the counterculture was rock and roll and included bands such as the Beatles, Rolling Stones, and Janis Joplin. Folk music, with its protest lyrics, was also popular, and the music of Joan Baez and Bob Dylan gave voice to the counterculture movement. Even views on sexual expression were changing. The counterculture coincided with the sexual revolution in America, which changed attitudes about premarital sex and helped usher in the beginnings of the gay rights movement. In 1960, the introduction of the birth control pill reduced the number of unwanted pregnancies and made casual sex more socially acceptable within the United States. Meanwhile, new gay rights organizations were being created to demand greater sexual tolerance. The Mattachine Society had been created in 1951 and used non-confrontational methods to try to educate the public on gay issues throughout the 1950s and the 1960s. Additionally, one of the most significant events in the gay rights movement occurred at the Stonewall Inn in New York. An attack on gay men by off-duty police officers led to the Stonewall Rebellion in 1969, which was an uprising in support of equal rights for gay people. The rebellion proved to be a turning point in the gay rights movement and led to a rise in activism within the gay community, which included the creation of organizations like the Gay Liberation Front. So, most historians agree that while the sexual revolution probably did not radically change the sexual behaviors of Americans, it was significant because it made Americans more likely to openly discuss issues of premarital sex, contraception, abortion, and homosexuality. And it paved the way for new civil rights movements within the United States. Another major characteristic of the youth culture of the 1960s was increased political activism. Concerned over the nuclear arms race and alarmed by continued racial prejudice at home, many middle-class children participated in organized protests on college campuses across the nation. The political activism of the counterculture originated in 1960 with the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS organization, which was formed by two University of Michigan students, Tom Hayden and Al Haber. 2 years later, Hayden organized a meeting in Port Huron to lay out the goals of the organization. The result was the Port Huron Statement, which became the manifesto for SDS and called for political reforms, racial equality, and greater rights for American workers. The Port Huron Statement marked the emergence of a larger liberal political movement known as the New Left. So, the New Left is the term that we use to describe the political activism of members of the counterculture. And it does not represent a single agenda, but rather a collection of liberal movements, including the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, feminism, and gay rights that were growing in power and influence in the 1960s. The New Left became popular within the youth culture of the 1960s because it appealed to their idealism. The baby boomer generation was jolted out of their political complacency by civil rights demonstrations, such as the Greensboro sit-ins in 1960, as well as President John F. Kennedy's calls to serve in the Peace Corps. So one of the first major protests of the New Left was the sit-in demonstrations, which occurred at UC Berkeley in the fall of 1964. Student activists returned to campus that fall after having spent the previous summer working with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, in Mississippi to register African Americans to vote as part of the Freedom Summer campaign. Their participation in Freedom Summer inspired them to push for changes on their college campus, but they quickly faced resistance from school officials who did not want any political demonstrations on the university's grounds. Concerned that their voices were being silenced by the school, students at UC Berkeley created the free speech movement in order to fight for their First Amendment rights. Led by Mario Savio, the free speech movement staged a sit-in at the administration building on the UC Berkeley campus, and over 1,000 students occupied the building peacefully. Eventually, the police were called in to end the sit-in protest, and over 800 students ended up being arrested. Despite the arrest, the university eventually gave in to the students' demands and allowed political activities on campus. So the success of the UC Berkeley sit-ins was influential on young political activists. The ideas and strategies of both the Students for a Democratic Society and the free speech movement spread to other college campuses in the 1960s, and student protests were used to make changes regarding mandatory ROTC programs, dress codes, curfews, and dorm policies. Now, As the war in Vietnam escalated, the New Left became closely associated with the anti-war movement. The Vietnam War was being fought primarily by young people. And while college students were given a deferment that allowed them to postpone their military service until after they graduated, the threat of being drafted to fight in an increasingly unpopular war was always looming over the heads of many young Americans. Opposition to the Vietnam War generated widespread protests both on and off of college campuses, and numerous rallies took place throughout the 1960s where young men burned their draft cards in defiance of the U.S. government. As the 1960s progressed, groups like the SDS became increasingly more militant. In the early years of the New Left, Tom Hayden and other leaders had advocated for civil disobedience and nonviolence. However, the war in Vietnam pushed young activists to become more radical and confrontational in their attempts to challenge authority figures. Perhaps the climax of the confrontational politics of the New Left was at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. In August of 1968, as the Democratic Party prepared to nominate its candidate for the presidency, thousands of anti-war demonstrators flooded into the streets of Chicago to protest the Vietnam War and the political status quo. The protesters were made up of a number of different activist groups, most notably the Youth International Party, or Yippies for short, which was led by Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman. The protesters occupied Chicago's Lincoln Park without a permit, and Mayor Richard Daley responded to the growing anti-war presence by beefing up security for the convention, arranging for barbed wire barricades, and calling in thousands of police officers and National Guard members to serve as security. Hostility grew between the police and anti-war protesters, as a number of protesters shouted obscenities and hurled rocks at police officers. Then, on August 25th, Mayor Daley ordered the police to enforce an 11 p.m. curfew and break up the protest at Lincoln Park. In what was later described as a police riot, thousands of police officers wearing riot gear, helmets, and gas masks attacked protesters with tear gas and clubs. The chaos of the moment was broadcast across television networks throughout the United States and deeply disturbed many Americans. The 1968 Democratic National Convention worried many middle-class Americans who now believed that America was coming apart at the seams. It also fragmented the New Left and the anti-war movement as well. Some young activists were appalled by the violence in Chicago and became even more committed to non-violent tactics in the pursuit of their agenda. However, other members of the New Left began to pursue more extreme tactics, such as the use of violence to end the war in Vietnam. Now, the turmoil in 1968 caused many young people to feel disaffected and abandon politics altogether. It is important to be able to separate some of the political activism of the era with the counterculture. While many people who were part of the counterculture were politically active, not all hippies were part of the New Left and vice versa. For those who were part of just the counterculture, the high point of this cultural revolution was Woodstock in 1969, which was billed as 3 days of peace and music. Woodstock was a free music concert that took place on a 600-acre farm near Bethel, New York. 400,000 people converged on the farm, creating a 50-mile traffic jam and greatly exceeding the expectation of the festival's promoters. The people who made it to Woodstock were treated to 3 days of nonstop music that included Creedence Clearwater Revival, The Who, The Grateful Dead, Santana, and Jimi Hendrix, just to name a few. For many people, Woodstock was much more than a rock concert. The 1960s had created an enormous amount of division within American society, especially between the older and younger generations. Many older Americans had come to look at America's youth with not only mistrust, but also disdain. For conservative Americans, the counterculture represented the end of modern civilization as they knew it. Mainstream Americans were becoming increasingly alarmed by extremists within the counterculture who were willing to use violence to protest against Vietnam or other issues. And many Americans were turned off by the support of socialism by some of its members. Yet, for the supporters of the counterculture, Woodstock represented the best qualities of the movement. For 3 days, 500,000 people had gathered on a farm to listen to music. The event had been peaceful and demonstrated unity among the baby boomer generation who had come together in opposition to war, racism, and poverty. Unfortunately, the spirit of peace that inhabited the Woodstock Festival was short-lived. After 1969, the hippie movement and the counterculture began to wane as some of the movement's ideas became counterproductive. For example, the sexual revolution of the 1960s, with its emphasis on free love, would give rise to new health concerns in the decades that followed over the risk of sexually transmitted diseases and the AIDS epidemic, which swept through the United States in the 1980s. More significantly, however, was the fact that by 1971, the New Left was no longer considered a legitimate political movement. The New Left had been destroyed by its growing radicalism and the abandonment of some of its original pacifist principles. Many Americans found the emergence of violent groups such as the Weather Underground especially alarming. The move towards extremism by some members killed much of the early idealism of the counterculture and the New Left. What's more, a great deal of campus activism disappeared altogether as the United States began to gradually withdraw from Vietnam in the early 1970s. So, as the hippies and flower children of the counterculture grew older and had children of their own, many of their causes were left unfinished. In the 1970s, the counterculture generation became more concerned about finding jobs of their own and settling down. However, the cultural and political revolution that they created still shapes our values as Americans today. Their fashion, music, emphasis on individuality, and social consciousness are still very important parts of our current society. And the counterculture gave birth to entirely new movements, such as the modern feminist movement and the LGBTQ movement. Even the environmental movement, which would gain momentum in the 1970s, can be attributed to the youth culture of the 1960s. So